Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and many thanks to all of you for joining us here today for this event held in collaboration between the Centre for Global Development and Labour Mobility Partnerships. So hopefully you all know that we're here today to discuss migration policy, specifically why so many countries only focus on those who are either high or low skilled, and how we can break out of this false dichotomy. So I'm joined today by a fantastic set of speakers. Firstly, we're going to hear a presentation by Labour Mobility Partnerships Senior Associate, Susanna Settler, who will talk through her brand new paper exploring what we call a skills mix. Then I'm going to turn to Natasha Iskander, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at New York University's Wagner School of Public Service, to speak about the interaction between skill levels, economic development, worker rights, and immigration more broadly. Then I'm going to open up to our wonderful panel. So joining Natasha on the panel will be Simon Bauer, the Chief Executive of Concordia, which is an organisation that works with UK agricultural employers to bring in workers under a newly opened immigration scheme. And finally, Kanyon Lee is a Senior Social Protection Specialist at the World Bank, and he's on secondment from the South Korean Ministry of Employment and Labour. He'll be speaking about the fantastic Korean electronic permit system. So if you have questions for our panelists, and I very much hope you do, please submit them to events@cgdev.org. You can tweet us at @cgdev with the hashtag CGDtalks, or you can submit your comments via YouTube. So personally, on behalf of myself and LAMP, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I'd like to now pass over to Susanna Settler for her presentation. Susanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Hunter, we can start the slides now, please. Today, I will be presenting findings, as Helen already mentioned, from our latest policy note that has been titled Skills Mix, Foreign-Born Workers Bring More Than University Degrees to High-Income Countries. And this policy note has been already posted on our website, lampforum.org. So let's start with the first slide, Hunter, please. The basis for our policy note is the concept of an economy being a complex system under which each worker's skills and specialization has its own value and complements the capabilities of others. A process that ultimately leads to increased overall growth. As Ricardo Hausmann found, complexity is in fact at the center of countries' economic growth and development. And the argument may be easier to understand using the recipe metaphor. So let's imagine that a simple economy makes bread. And this bread only requires a few ingredients, including a great deal of flour, but no eggs. And then a more sophisticated economy produces both bread and cake. And cake requires flour and eggs. And then even a more sophisticated economy might produce a variety of breads, pastries, and cakes, which requires the specialized skills of a chef who can create new recipes using existing and new ingredients. However, each of these economies still need flour to produce their goods. So in terms of immigration, high-income countries strive to attract more entrepreneurs, IT, and other experts with advanced degrees to continue expanding the range and depth of sophistication of their economies, but the recipes for modern economies still require flour. In other words, there is still a need for caregivers for the young and the old, as well as cleaners, roofers, painters, and retail workers. And all these workers, whether native or foreign-born, offer a wide range of skills and abilities, from social and cultural skills to those learned from previous experiences or even at school, which advances and increases the complexity of an economy. The next slide, please. And yet, when it comes to foreign-born specifically, in many existing labor mobility systems in high-income countries, they traditionally use a dichotomy based on educational attainment of these foreign-born workers, simply splitting them into two groups, high-skilled or low-skilled. So the low-skilled are typically those who have less schooling than a bachelor's degree and work, for example, as agricultural and construction laborers, welders, and caregivers, while the so-called high-skilled workers typically have at least 4-year degree and work as IT experts, medical doctors, scientists, and other professionals with degrees or post-secondary education. However, the exact definition of skilled varies by country, as each of them sets its own eligibility criteria and types of visas. But no matter how exactly each country defines low and high skill, this dichotomy undermines effective mobility systems in several ways. The overall rigid and simplified skills definitions often limit mobility pathways for workers who might have some post-secondary education or training, but lack a 4-year degree. These workers are sometimes called the middle-skilled workers. And although some countries recently introduced certain programs for some middle-skill occupations, such as caregivers, and others, only a few countries' migration systems recognize middle-skilled foreign-born workers as a standalone stream. In practice, middle-skilled workers are then often categorized as low-skilled and thus restricted to the same few pathways, regardless of them having training and certification in their fields. Another important issue with the skills dichotomy is that it overlooks other difficult to measure skills that workers also bring to the receiving country. These are the technical, social, and cultural abilities and interpersonal competencies. And surveys show that businesses and companies are increasingly interested in workers with critical thinking, interpersonal learning, and other soft skills. But the narrowly defined skill level also diminish the value of workers, native and foreign-born. That's another issue with the dichotomy. Since these occupations are typically labored low wage or low skill. And yet studies show that foreign-born workers who are considered low skilled due to their lack of schooling are in fact quite skilled. In the policy note, we cite a recent study on work and mobility among Mexican immigrants in low-skill occupations in the United States that found that foreign-born workers with low levels of schooling still bring skills from their home country that they use in the United States, and that a lack of schooling and credentialing does not correlate with the worker's lack of ability or desire to learn. Overall, the dichotomy based on workers' schooling does not reflect the actual skills and value that workers bring to the receiving countries, because it's impossible to fully assess the ability of workers solely based on their schooling. Moreover, this seemingly simple skills dichotomy used in many high-income countries' mobility schemes prevents employing sectors from bringing in the variety of workers they need, and thus hampers the process of increasing complexity in the involved economies, ultimately limiting the growth and development. The next slide, please. And studies show that high-income countries have been facing increasing worker scarcity. This trend is caused by the inevitable demographic changes caused by low fertility rates and aging populations. Based on the United Nations Zero Migration Scenario, the working age populations of OECD countries will decline more than 92 million by 2050, while at the same time, the elderly population over age of 65 will grow by more than 100 million people. Next slide, please. So this unprecedented scarcity keeps employers from being able to hire enough workers with the required skills. And many sectors that struggle the most with worker scarcity need workers who are typically considered low or middle skilled. In the United States, occupations that do not require any degree, including home health and personal care aides, as well as fast food counter workers and restaurant cooks, were among the jobs with the largest absolute growth in worker demand projected for 2019 through 2029. And in 2020, European countries reported shortages on occupations such as nursing, plumbers, cooks, heavy truck drivers, and welders. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has caused economic swings as many businesses were forced to close their doors and millions of employees around the world were furloughed. But these long-term demographic trends I just described are unlikely to change. So Even though some high-income countries have begun exploring labor mobility as a possible solution to labor scarcity, they often focus primarily on skilled workers. Next slide, please. And so there are very few channels through which employers in high-income countries may bring in non-seasonal, low and middle-skilled workers. For example, the United States mobility system currently provides 0 pathways for non-seasonal occupations requiring less than a college degree. Switzerland does not allow individuals from non-EU countries to work unless they are considered highly qualified, which means they must hold a university degree and have professional work experience. And similarly, the Netherlands, to say a few of the examples, only has a few pathways to bring non-EU low and middle skilled workers. So it's important to know, though, that seasonal work represents a significant exception to the trend I just described, but those programs are designed to restrict low-skilled workers' access to host countries as well. So, for example, the United States, the non-agricultural seasonal worker program, which is for occupations in landscaping, forestry, and others, helps employers fill job vacancies during peak seasons. However, it has been restricted by an annual cap of 66,000 workers. And that's even though the employers have been calling since the early 2000s for increase in this limit as they are struggling with filling these jobs. In 2019, the British government announced the beginning of its seasonal worker pilot, or the initial pilot, through which farmers can recruit a limited number of temporary workers. The original program was set up for 2,500, then increased to 10, then to 30,000 workers for 2021. However, this is still far from filling the 80,000 worker gap reported by farmers in the UK. But besides the lack of pathways and numerical limits, the argument that high-income countries tend to prefer and favor so-called high-skilled and low-skilled foreign-born workers is also evident in the discrepancy of the rights provided to each of the two groups. As Martin Ruth suggests in his book, The Price of Rights, programs targeting more highly skilled foreign-born workers tend to grant such workers greater rights than do the low-skill programs. The countries of the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf, or GCC, are among the most open to low-skilled workers, while they also provide these individuals with very weak labor standards and limited rights. And another similar example is Singapore, which is also quite open to foreign-born workers, while also imposing considerable restrictions on their rights. Next slide, please. So now the question is, why are low-skilled workers out of the high-income country spotlight? So according to Roos, there are at least 3 reasons why high-income countries are more likely to favor highly skilled foreign-born workers. First, they expect that such workers will better complement the existing skills and capital of their population. Second, they value the importance of human capital and knowledge for long-term economic growth as predicted by endogenous growth models. And third is the dependence of the overall fiscal impact of immigration on workers' earnings, which tend to be linked to their skills. So overall, since high-income countries tend to be quite knowledge-based, their lawmakers tend to think that recruiting what they consider to be the best and brightest will further speed up their country's technological advancement and development. Our note touches also on the impact of the powerful lobby that exists in this space. Now, there is, of course, nothing wrong with attracting highly skilled workers, but it should not be a country's sole focus, because employing sectors need workers with a wide variety of skills, experience, and abilities. And the low-skill sectors are in dire need of workers, as mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Next slide, please. But on top of all of that, research shows the importance of low-skilled workers in lives of peoples in the receiving high-income countries and how much they increase overall productivity. Foreign-born workers often perform difficult jobs such as mowing lawns, picking berries, washing dishes, or building roads. And these are all tasks that add to the economic complexity and thereby contribute to the economic growth of the receiving countries. And again, this all links back to the very beginning of this presentation when I talked about complexity as described by Hausman and talking about the recipe metaphor. Additionally, as foreign-born workers enter occupations that require local skill levels, native-born workers tend to move away from such jobs and begin to improve their economic status. For example, in the United States, data show that the increase in foreign-born workers entering the country who are willing to engage in lower-skill occupations allow native-born population to become more educated and skilled and to pursue other jobs. And a separate study revealed that low-skill immigration into the United States allow highly skilled women to decrease the amount of time they spend on household work and significantly increase the number of hours they can dedicate to their field. Similar trends could be also seen from a study on Hong Kong and others. So overall, the research suggests that immigration reduces the total cost of household services, prompts the native-born workers to become more productive, and helps highly skilled women work additional hours or have more children. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the attitudes about migration among the public? We will hear more about this topic, I think, in a few minutes during the following presentations, and the panel. But let me just tell you that a recent research showed that most people are not strictly for or against immigration, but rather for somewhere in the middle, in that they are more anxious, conflicted, but movable. Such individuals are usually quite open to some shifting of their views on immigration. That's the sense in which they are movable, but they have concerns. And they are also the most vulnerable to hostile narratives and misinformation. But if the argument were approached in a better way, demonstrating the economy's need for these individuals, most people in this category could be convinced that their countries need more foreign-born workers at all skill levels. And another slide, please. Thank you. So in conclusion, I know it was a lot, but I will just say that to increase the complexity of their economies and thereby boost economic growth, high-income countries need workers with a broad variety of skills and the ability to learn, not only workers with a particular level of schooling. And given the demographic challenges faced by high-income countries, foreign-born workers could help fill the job gaps. But the traditional dichotomy of low and high-skilled workers solely based on individuals' level of education prevents their labor mobility systems, which tend to favor high-skilled workers from bringing foreign-born workers with a broader variety of skills. So in summary, a productive society includes people with a broad range of skills that complement each other, and therefore workers should be seen as offering a skills mix composed of all their experiences and abilities gained in and out of school, as well as their interpersonal communication, cultural, and other social skills. And therefore, rather than building mobility pathways based on workers' level of schooling, receiving countries should consider schemes that are more based on the needs of their employing sectors. And I will just conclude there. I know it was a lot of information, but I'm very excited about the discussion and following remarks. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for the fascinating presentation. I think you've done a really excellent job of laying out the case for why high-income countries should consider diversifying, the number of people and the types of people that they're bringing in. And I think it raises really interesting practical questions, as if you're going to be moving away from a system that purely discriminates based on educational attainment, what do you then do? How do you set up a system that actually measures people's hard and soft skills and admits people that employers need? Maybe I'll touch on it quickly now because you've already brought it up, but I do think that there is a lot of concern among policymakers and politicians that actually their publics are not in favor of more low and medium skilled immigration. And yet, as you've neatly shown, research shows that isn't the case. So I know Europe the best, so I'll use data from there. According to the European Social Survey, around 60% of Europeans support skilled migration, regardless of the country that somebody comes from. Now, what's interesting about using the terminology skilled migration is if you ask people whether they support more immigration or not, you'll get mixed answers. But if you start drilling down into specific professions, overall, people are far more positive about specific professions where they know that there is a need. And those professions are in a huge wide range of occupations and skill levels. So I actually think that the public in a lot of these countries is far more nuanced than policymakers and politicians really think. And this has all been exacerbated by COVID. So there was an interesting study in the UK in June last year, which found that 64% of people felt that because of COVID, they now valued the role of low-skilled immigrant workers in the UK more than they had before. And they were in favor of expanding immigration within those sectors, particularly obviously in healthcare. So I do think that what you've laid out today really does illustrate the fact that these countries do have support from both their public and their employers to expand pathways at different skill levels. But exactly how to do that is the practical question that we're going to get onto in our panel. So Natasha, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to pass over to you now for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susanna, for a really comprehensive and elegant presentation, and Helen for that beautiful segue. I thought I would reflect on something that Susanna raised that I think is really critical, which is that there's a clear and demonstrated need for labor at all skill levels by migrant receiving nations, and yet the policies that these nations implement continually limit the flow of labor to receiving countries. And the question is why? Why this disconnect between the demonstrated need and the policy? And I think it's useful to reflect on why immigration policy in general tends to be very disconnected from the empirical needs of economies. It just seems like a principle of immigration policy. But I think in this particular realm, it's worth exploring what that disconnect is about. And I think I want to draw on another point that Susanna raised, the fixation on the division between low and high skilled as a way to begin thinking about what this disconnect is about. And to ask, what are we really talking about when we're talking about skill, high skilled and low skilled in particular? Skill is a particularly vulnerable area to be misinterpreted, or particularly propitious area to apply all sorts of interpretations on that have nothing to do with skill, because skill is very hard to define. So skill has multiple dimensions. It can be explicit, it can be tacit, it has multiple registers: emotional, analytic, visual, kinesthetic, and multiple social values. We think about certain kinds of skills as high skilled, regardless of their actual skill content, and certain kinds of skills as low skilled or more easily accessible, regardless of their skill content. On some level, there's a correlation here between the distance from, or the perceived distance from the body. So manual skills tend to be characterized as low skilled, whereas skills we define as cognitive tend to be attributed to being high skilled. Although, if you're a surgeon, you don't want your surgeon just to have cognitive skill, you want your surgeon to also have some manual skill. And how we define and value skill is also contextual, changes over time, changes based on our social values, changes based on who does a particular job, right? So skill gets gendered, for example. So these characteristics of skill make it really difficult to define and measure. And as a result, skill becomes a proxy for a whole host of social and cultural beliefs and policy agendas. And in particular, it becomes a really powerful vehicle for skill stratification. And the reason that skill is such an effective tool for the implementation of social and cultural beliefs and social hierarchies is that skill is believable. We attach an economic value to skill, and we don't view it in the same way, or we don't critique it in the same way we might critique other markers of social difference, like race or gender or ethnicity, etc. Okay, so let's come back to immigration policy. In immigration policy, what are skills a proxy for? And what does this mean for the kinds of immigration skill pathways that Susanna has encouraged us to contemplate? Okay, so let's start with what they are a proxy for. Clearly, they're a proxy for different things in different economies, although there are really important similarities. What I would suggest here is that instead of defining what skills are a proxy for in a uniform way, we think about a method for evaluating what skills are a proxy for in different contexts. So the first really important thing about this method is to understand that skills are evaluated in immigration policy at a point in time, which is the point of entry. Skills are viewed as a fixed attribute that do not evolve over time from this policy frame. They're evaluated at the moment that the policy determines entry or exclusion. And this gives us a snapshot of what immigration policy tells us about the value of skill in society and the institutional tools in an economy for valuing and making skill visible. Okay, so a couple of ways in which we decide to value skill. Many of these have been outlined by Susanna, but let me just do a quick list. First, formal education. Formal education is the easiest, most accessible, most translatable across economies and context measure of skill. And we tend to believe that that is what we're measuring. But in fact, there are a whole series of other attributes just underneath. One of the most important, of course, is income and class. When we're talking about high skilled, we're often talking about high income. We're also often talking about national origin and race. We have seen this in the US in particular in discussions about moving toward a merit-based immigration system. Very close to the surface under those discussions are large and significant questions about race, the racial makeup of immigration flows, etc. Rights associated with different skill classes. This is again a point that Susanna raised. We associate either legally or symbolically different sets of rights to immigrants we view as skilled versus those we view as unskilled. So high skilled immigrants, we value their ability to move through space. We value their ability to be entrepreneurs. So we endow them with freedom and creativity, connectivity, social mobility. We give them a whole set of attributes that depend on a wide array of political rights, whereas unskilled migrants are the migrants who are detained, deported, incarcerated. If you think about the carceral systems in our immigration systems, we rarely imagine that an engineer or a doctor is incarcerated waiting for their immigration case to be adjudicated, although high-skilled immigrants are also often out of status. Okay, so now what does this mean for the construction of immigrant skill pathways? So the first is that we foreclose with this fixed point in time assessment. We foreclose the opportunity for immigrants to develop skill over time. So skill is not an ontological attribute, something that we develop over time. And these immigrant pathways foreclose that opportunity in two ways. One, through the assessment, and the second is by the limitations of the rights that are required to develop skill over time. And in particular, the most significant right that is required to develop skill over time is to divorce the right of residence from the right to work. And this is because skill development often requires flexibility in the labor market to choose jobs that allow you to develop skills as you see fit, and also to often withdraw from the labor market temporarily to seek additional education, apprenticeship opportunities, etc. So this divorcing of the right to work and the right to residence is actually paradoxically critical for the development of skills in the workforce. And then one additional point, immigration policy, we tend to think about it as affecting immigrant workers, but in fact, immigration policy is one of the main ways we structure the labor market and its values. So immigration policy fixes our definition of skill and creates a bifurcation in our labor market institutions between high-skilled and low-skilled. And this affects not just immigrant workers. And so an attention to the ways in which the rhetoric around immigration forecloses larger discussions around the right to learn and how we build institutions to foster that, apprenticeship systems, educational systems, on-the-job learning systems, skill evaluation systems, childcare systems. All of these are about the right to learn. And if we deny that to immigrants, we are implicitly denying that to all workers. So with that, I'll end my comments. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natasha. And yeah, perfectly complements Susanna's setup as well. I thought almost the last point you made was one of the more interesting ones, that actually the way we construct the immigration system has much broader resonance beyond the immigration system. And if you, as a native-born worker sitting in a country, are worried about the way your economy values or doesn't value workers at different skills, maybe we should be looking at our immigration policies as to why that is the case. So I'd now like to open up to our panel. So Natasha will be joined by Kanyon and Simon, who I introduced earlier. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to send them through on the YouTube channel or tweet them out to us or email us, and we'll be able to get to those in about half an hour. But to begin with, I'd like to ask a couple of questions of our panelists about the immigration systems that they've been working on, developing and implementing. So my first question is to you, Kanyon. So prior to 2003, the Korean government had no official provisions for the entry of temporary low-skilled foreign labor. Would you be able to give us a brief overview of Korea's employment permit system and the policy objectives that the government of Korea hoped to achieve with it?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me this important and meaningful online event, and thank you for your interest in Korean EPS. Let me tell you a little bit about the brief overview of Korean EPS, employment permit system. EPS is a system that allows small and medium-sized enterprises that cannot employ Korean national workers to legally employ foreign low-skilled workers to respond to their labor shortage in certain sector, for example, manufacture, agriculture, fishery, and construction. Basically, it is managed as a government-to-government arrangement to ensure transparency and boost effectiveness. Korean government signed MOU with the governments of sending countries about quotas and sending and receiving process, the role of each government, and so on. Nearly everything about the labor mobility. After that, of course, private sector can be involved in the EPS, but the most part of the system is managed by both the sending and receiving government body. And there are two types of employment permit system. One is for foreign workers from 16 countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand and Philippines and so on, who gets E9 visa. They mainly working in manufacture, agriculture and fishery and construction. Another is Korean origin workers, mainly coming from China or Russia, who gets H2 visiting employment visa. This type is very specific to Korean situation and history. And they normally working in service industries such as food, retail and wholesale and lodging, that kind of service industry. To guarantee stability and effectiveness of this system, EPS is based on the Act on Employment of Foreign Workers. As a decision-making body, Foreign Workers Policy Committee, which is chaired by the head of Prime Minister's office and composed of relevant ministries, discuss and determine critical issues of this system, like I said, quotas or sectors, and also labor unions, corporate federations, and labor mobility experts also participate in this committee. We take multi-stakeholder approach to this system, but for the implementation, EPS has single implementing agency, Human Resources Development Korea, which is affiliated organization of Ministry of Employment and Labor, is managing the whole process and implementation, including the whole process, like recruitment, job placement, and labor migration, and as well as return policy, return process. And the last thing, policy objective of the Korean government wants to achieve is very clear. Since EPS was introduced as a part of economic and labor policy, it is aimed to resolve the labor shortage of SMEs, and by doing so, to boost the economy. In addition to it, while protecting rights and interests of foreign workers, Korean government is also promoting co-development and prosperity of both Korea and sending countries with this system. Let me stop here with the overview of brief overview and policy objectives of EPS. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Kenyon. You make it sound very obvious, but I'm sure that you struggled in terms of the designs of development and implementation of the EPS in different ways, with lessons for a lot of the people who have signed on today. So Simon, I'd like to pass over to you now. So would you be able to take us through why you felt it was necessary for the UK government to relaunch its seasonal worker scheme, and why you personally think it's important to look beyond these sort of high and low skilled workers? And finally, a little bit of the question I was hinting at with Kang-Young, what kind of barriers did you face when you're establishing the program? Could you talk us through those?
Yeah, will do. Thank you, Helen. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to Zuzana for the perfect metaphor about the flour and the economy needing flour, because that's a large part of what we do. Is we're bringing in the workers who actually harvest the wheat or the vegetables or whatever it is. And if you don't do that, then you don't have a very healthy workforce in the rest of the economy. So yeah, there are some skills and some jobs that are fundamental and basic to building your economy. And that's what we're involved in. Maybe a brief history of who we are and how we fit into the overall scheme of things. We are a charity, so we're not affiliated to any government organizations, and we're not beholden to shareholders. We are a charity. We were founded during World War II And the rationale for our founding was to fill the need, the skill shortage in the UK, and also provide employment and opportunities for people from war-torn countries in Europe, which had fewer opportunities. So a perfect example of what Zuzana was talking about need. That was the reason for Concordia being founded in the first place. The regulatory regime under which we operated was very different back in those days. Underwent a seismic shift about 30 years ago, with Britain becoming more aligned with the EU. And that found its final fulfillment in 2013, when freedom of movement throughout the EU became absolute. So anyone from a country that was in the EU could come to Britain to work without needing any restricted visas or any other kind of passport, or they could literally come in with their ID card. After the country voted for Brexit, the UK government realized quite rightly that there would be a withdrawal of some of this labour, and it looked at which sectors of the economy and which jobs would be needed to be boosted by a scheme that enabled people to come over here. So they looked at the Australian points-based immigration scheme, and they based their immigration schemes largely on that. Now, you may think some of the points that are awarded to people are contentious, but that's what it is. That's what we have to work with. So, for example, the first point is language. Now, there are some jobs in which I don't think your language ability is necessarily a predictor of how well you'll do in that job, but these are the things we have to work with. So language, your perceived level of skill, to pick up on Natasha's point. There are points awarded for the salary range in which your job falls, and you can earn extra immigration points if your job is in a shortage occupation, and those shortage occupations are designed and designated by a committee called the Migration and Advisory Committee, which reports to Parliament. They produced their latest report in September last year. Now, there are 5 tiers of different types of immigration within this UK system, and we currently work with 3 of those tiers. There's an extra tier, which is called a health visa. Countries throughout Europe and the UK were struggling for health workers before the pandemic. And it's now particularly acute. The pandemic has exacerbated that. So there is a huge demand throughout Europe for workers in health occupations. So nurses, doctors, anyone in pharmacists, anyone in the healthcare system. What's interesting is that, going back to Zuzana, one of Zuzana's slides, I think care workers are not included in that health visa. Whether they should be or not is open to debate, but certainly there's a shortage in that sector now. So we are mainly involved in the Tier 5 visa, although we do work with the Tier 1 visa, which is students and volunteers as well. Volunteers can come over from overseas and study and reside in the UK. But our main focus is with the Tier 5 visa for agricultural workers. Now, they are given a visa for 6 months maximum, and it's designed so that they can come throughout the harvest season, work on UK farms, earn money which is, very useful to them, better than they would earn in their home countries. They do have quite a lot of rights and protections, no different than if they were in a skilled occupation. And one of our aims as a charity is, and one of the things that we are able to do with the funds we generate from this program, because we charge the farms for our services, and we try to generate a small surplus above our costs, and we try to plough that surplus back over the years into training programs. So 1 or 2 success stories on that are one of our trustees at Concordia on the board of trustees is a graduate from our seasonal agricultural workers scheme. He did a management training program, and he's now the HR manager at one of our customers, and he's now one of our trustees. A very good example during the recent pandemic as well was I had to phone up an airline who wouldn't allow our workers to board their plane because they'd misread the immigration rules around the scheme. So I phoned the chap who was in charge of their operations at Luton Airport and explained the situation to him. He said, right, I'll sort it out, hung up the phone, came back to me about 5 minutes later, and I said, wow, that was great, that was really efficient. And he said, yeah, I should be. I learned on your management training scheme. I was a seasonal agricultural worker, and he's now in charge of operations for the airline at Heathrow. So that was great. So that's kind of where we stand on the immigration system. Our goal is, if we're bringing in what we're calling low-skilled workers into this agricultural sector on a temporary visa, we can help them through our bursaries and through our training programs to develop things that they might want in their future career, which can be a pathway to permanent immigration. I want to be clear, the Tier 5 agricultural scheme is currently precluded from that. It's not a pathway to long-term migration. However, there are ways around that, and one of them is training and getting them to work long-term. If they come back for several years in a row with a particular farm and develop a relationship with them and develop the skills, whether it's supervisory, managerial, whatever skills that farm needs, that's what we're all about. So I think it's a kind of a synthesis of what Zuzana was talking about in terms of filling a need, and what Natasha was talking about in terms of not judging people by the level at which they enter the country, but giving them a chance to show what they can do and develop them, which helps both them and our country and our economy. And they're probably able to send some money home and help people back home as well. That's it from me, I think, for now.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's a really fascinating overview of the new points-based immigration system here in the UK. And as you say, there are a lot of complexities within it, but definitely a recognition of the need of the UK economy post-Brexit. I'd like to ask both Kenyon and Simon, obviously both of these systems are broad, complex, building on a lot of different previous programs, but also future needs. I was wondering, what barriers did you face in establishing these programs, implementing these programs? Were there concerns from policymakers or the public about what the impact would be, and how did you overcome those barriers?
Shall I go first?
Sure, go ahead.
So yeah, one of the principal concerns of the UK government was to ensure that the scheme didn't have a negative effect on public services. So, for example, we undertook as part of the scheme to report back to the government on the amount of health services, dental services, and other public services that are consumed by the workers whilst they're over here. And at the same time, we report back on the amount of tax. And we have a strange tax, an employment tax over here called national insurance. So we report that back to them as well. So one of the governments, and I think Zuzana and Natasha would probably take issue with this because it's a fairly short-term view, but one of the government's short-term objectives was to make sure that the amount of goods consumed by the workers coming in and using public services was at least equal to the amount of benefit we as an economy got. And we don't have to report on the social benefit or the benefit to the worker of what they're doing. So the measurement could be more sophisticated, I think.
Thank you. Kenyon?
Okay, for the barriers, before the EPS, there exists ITS system, which is industrial training system in Korea. Similar to current EPS, it is also a system that allow small and medium-sized enterprises to legally employ foreign national low-skilled workers. Main difference was that ITS was not a government arrangement. So no MOUs with sending countries. There was no clear definition of the role of sending and receiving countries. This industrial training system had some problems like high migration costs, sometimes corruption and fraud by the middlemen, and poor working conditions because there's no government intervention, sometimes human rights issues, of course, and there's a lot of illegal overstay. So there was a sort of consensus to improve or reform of this ITS. But the barrier is that what systems should we introduce and how to deal with the already existing illegal immigrants. So various stakeholders, there are lots of stakeholders, especially for the immigration policy, presented their opinions. For example, small and medium business administration, which is government body, and the small and medium corporate association worried that the increase of labor cost. So they urge maintain the ITS, the then current system, and labor unions and foreign workers insisted government should introduce a new labor permit system, as in advanced country like Germany, which allow more freedom to work for foreign workers. As the ITS problem was still going on, so the Korean government made and continued its effort to persuade both labor and management sides. Like most of the labor issues, both sides finally reached agreement somewhere in the middle. So to introduce new framework under the government intervention to the new system, firms, corporates could get a stable foreign labor supply, and workers were able to improve their rights and working conditions. So that's how the Korean government introduced a new system, EPS system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No. Yeah, the Korean government decided to establish a new system to employ low-skilled foreign workers transparently and stably, and also protect their working conditions under the leadership of public sector. So finally, it was this introducing new framework. This policy was included in the presidential election pledges policy of the candidates for both ruling and opposition parties. So therefore, in 2004, the EPS could be introduced successfully in Korea. Yeah, that's it.
No, thank you very much. And actually, both of you, I think, touched on something Susanna mentioned, which is this tension between opening up pathways at all levels while also being rights respecting and ensuring that everybody who is brought in under those pathways has access to the same rights and freedoms as others. And there's definitely a tension there, as Susanna was pointing out, that there are many countries around the world that are much more liberal in terms of opening up their systems, but don't necessarily invest as much in the rights of those people that are coming in. And that's not, the system we want to end up with either. So how do you find that balance between ensuring that those rights are provided while also making sure employers have access to the people that they need? I'd like to pass over to Natasha now. So, given you've heard a lot from Simon and Kang-Young about the challenges of setting up different systems and the need to do so, I would like to know what you think about the kind of barriers and the discussion that we've had today, but also we've spoken a lot about the impact of these pathways on receiving countries. Maybe you could say a little bit about what the impact of such pathways can have on the migrants themselves and why that's important for them to be able to access those pathways.
So I think that's an excellent question. And I think, it's really hard to disentangle what these pathways mean for the migrants themselves and for the economy as a whole, because those two interest groups actually are synergistic. So, you know, if you think about it, migrating without a path, I mean, migration is demand driven, right? So people come to take jobs that exist, right? If there's no demand, there's no migration. And this is a documented feature of migration systems. If you don't provide people with a pathway, they come out of status, they migrate under conditions that are dangerous, that are impoverishing, and that don't allow them to demonstrate their skill when they arrive. Right? So it's very expensive to migrate in an irregular pathway. Right? It's very dangerous. And when you arrive, you take whatever job you can get in the informal sector. Right? You can imagine that if you had more ample pathways for migration at all skill levels, those costs, those dangers, and those dehumanizing practices wouldn't exist for migrants in the same way, and they could enter the labor market at their skill level and continue to develop their skills, right? One of the very interesting thing about migration to the US, particularly from Latin America, Central America, and Mexico, is the fact that many of the people who arrive have skills, not just skills that we need to expand our traditional definition of skill to understand, but architects, designers, people with 2 to 4 years of college education. And the process of migrating through irregular channels actually positions them at the very bottom of the labor market when they enter. And that's such a loss to the economy. Immigration policy is the only place where the government deliberately and explicitly imposes economic costs on society to achieve social ends. I mean, it does this in other areas, but explicitly in immigration policy. And this is really shocking, problematic, shocking, and leaves a lot of room for engagement to undo those frameworks. In terms of kind of the impacts that pathways can have on people's contribution back home, those are not dissimilar from kind of the income pathways that they can access, the skill development pathways they can access, the ability to remain connected in person, right? The ability to travel back and forth across borders. I want to just add 2 little details here. I think that there's a tendency in the discussion of pathways to talk about return, immigrant return, as if that were necessarily desirable. And I would suggest that we think about challenging that framework, that in fact, economies around the world need workers, right? Particularly traditional migrant receiving countries, for demographic reasons, apart from anything else, desperately need workers. So the emphasis on return is just as costly and problematic as some of these other questions. But return also allows for the possibility of moving back and forth without the necessity of return, allows for the entanglement of societies and economies in ways that are deeply beneficial on both sides of the border. And then one last little correction, Helen, is the representation of Gulf economies. So it's interesting to note, as kind of part of our conversation, that the rights frameworks for workers in the GCC don't differentiate by skill level. So that you often have, CEOs and high-level managers constrained in the exact same ways as laborers or construction workers. And yet we assume that there's a difference because we've wedded notions of skill and political rights. Thank you.
No, that's all fascinating. Thank you so much, Natasha. So I just have one more question for our panel before we open up to the floor, and I've already got a bank of really excellent questions that I'm going to make you all respond to. I'm hoping that we have many people who've signed on to this event today who are working in countries who are considering similar schemes to what Kanyon and Simon have outlined today, but aren't necessarily sure how to go about building the political and public support for expanding such the schemes. So I was wondering whether all three of you have any advice for countries in that position about how they can maybe talk about the needs within their economy and the needs for more migrants at different skill levels to be able to build the support for those pathways. So Simon, I'd like to go first to you, then to Kanyon, and finally to Natasha.
Okay, so I think one of the most important things is you need a coalition of people who have needs. So for example, in the agricultural sector, we have an organization in the UK called the National Farmers Union, and that represents the farming lobby as a whole. So they were able to speak with one voice and go to the UK government and explain exactly what the nationwide picture looked like in terms of demand for agricultural workers. And they were able to state their case and back it up with statistics that they'd gathered from across the industry. So I think backing up your case with clearly showing the demand, getting your people to your congregation to speak with one voice so that you have one figurehead speaking to government, so you've got one clear message. That's really important. And I know Kanyon was talking about SMEs as well. I'm sure that he was able to get SMEs to work together as well to help to push the case for these schemes.
Thank you. Kanyon?
Okay, foreign labor policy and immigration policies are very controversial most of the time. Even in Korea, even for the EPS, we kind of successfully introduced this system, but every year when the decision-making committee determine the quota and sector of the next year, every the debate tension goes up very high among specific sectors or labor unions, between labor unions and corporate federations. Yeah, so there is a lot of controversy there. So therefore, I think the most important thing is to design a system that is politically acceptable, and especially in receiving country, and a system that should be economically beneficial to both sending and receiving countries. If it's not politically acceptable, it is difficult to get public support. And if it's not economically helpful to both countries, the system would not be sustainable. Second, I think it is necessary to create decision-making body that various stakeholders participate in. This is because immigration policy has a large impact on labor, industry, as well as the economy. The last one is take EPS as an example. A multi-stakeholder process for policy making, but with a single implementing agency can be very effective governance model. And the implementing agency in Korea, it has both responsibility, authority, and responsibility to implement the system. In order to effectively operate the system, the Human Resource Development Korea is in charge of the overall system under the supervision of Ministry of Employment and Labor. And HRD Korea takes the initiative to operate the system, and they also collaborate with related organizations such as the local offices of Ministry of Employment and Labor for skill development or job matching, and the Ministry of Justice for entry and exit of the foreign workers by, for example, by connecting and managing the data, related data from these institutions. That way we can increase the effectiveness of the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.
I think politicians need to make an affirmative case for immigration. There's a lot of tentativeness around the fact that these pathways are controversial and you have to handle them gently in the political sphere. But as Susanna pointed out, there's an ambivalent middle. And that ambivalent middle can be swayed. And paying attention to questions of representation, paying attention to the affirmative case for immigration and making it boldly, I think is an incredibly useful way of creating the political space to talk about the logistics and the details of these pathways.
Thank you very much all. There were some really fantastic and concrete ideas in that last set of responses. I just want to pick up on a couple. I do think it's incredibly important to bring together a coalition of those that have relevant needs that can speak together with one voice. And touching on Kanyon's last point about data, making sure that we have good evaluations that showcase the impact of pathways to those employers, I do think is important for bringing other employers on board and for convincing others this is a really beneficial thing that is having a productive impact. I think secondly, Kanyon, I'm really glad that you brought up the impact of sending countries, and that's something we don't talk enough about, making sure that the countries that people come from are also benefiting from these pathways through remittances or other forms of investment, to make sure that we're building some genuine migration partnerships rather than schemes where we're merely sort of taking the best and brightest. And thirdly, definitely your last point, Natasha, I couldn't agree more, making this positive case for immigration and the impact that it can have. And too often when politicians do this, they're solely talking about highly skilled immigrants. They're talking about entrepreneurs, they're talking about business creators. But if we can start building this constituency for migration at all levels, I think that provides a lot more political space, as you say, to start talking about the details. Stop treating people like they're idiots, stop thinking they don't really understand the needs of the economy, and really start thinking through how we can build something that's beneficial for all. So I'd really like to thank my panel for all of their responses today, and we've got about 20 minutes left for Q&A from the audience. I have 4 questions through already, and I think they're all fantastic. I'm going to pitch the first two, the first one to Susanna, and then the second one to Simon and Kanyon. And I'd like to hear responses, and then I'll go to the last two. So the first one, Susanna, is about the situation in the US. So they ask, do you see the current challenge in hiring workers in many sectors in the US? Is that a temporary byproduct of COVID unemployment benefits or things that have happened during the pandemic? Or are they a lasting trend, like you were talking about with demographic change? And if it is a lasting trend, do you think now is a political sort of potential opportunity to start talking more coherently about labor mobility to the US? Susanna?
Thank you, Helen. So absolutely, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic definitely, as I mentioned, showed some temporary trends that we are seeing now that I think provides a perfect opportunity to actually talk about migration pathways and about the need to bring more workers. And I think that we should actually take this opportunity while it lasts and talk to the representatives and we were talking specifically about the US, but I think it's also the truth in other high-income countries around the world that should take this opportunity, because as I mentioned, the long-term trends clearly show that there will be labor scarcity, not just labor shortages, but labor scarcity, meaning it's not just about the fact that, what we sometimes hear, that people don't want to take certain jobs and so on. It's more about the fact that there is not enough people to do these jobs in high-income countries. So I think that COVID-19 really provided a perfect opportunity for us to start addressing this issue before we get to a point of even further crisis, because we already are at a point of crisis. So I always believe that it's better to address problems right at the onset before we get further into the trouble. So yes, definitely.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susanna. And that comes back to something Simon was mentioning around the increased demand for health workers. I definitely think there's been a lot more scope in the last 6 months to talk about health worker migration around the world in the wake of COVID, and we should, never waste a good crisis. Simon, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I had my hand raised. That's very interesting because we've got some data around that, because at the beginning of the pandemic last year, the government in the UK introduced this furlough scheme so that workers weren't immediately hit by unemployment, and they were able to be retained by their companies, but on a lower wage. And so the feeling from government was that at the time that some of the shortfall in agricultural workers in the summer in the UK would be filled by native-born workers who were on furlough or whose jobs were under threat from the pandemic. And we gathered quite a lot of data around that. It didn't work. So we still needed migration, even with the sorts of people's jobs disappearing and people being on furlough. So.
And if I may just very quickly follow up on actually above the points that you, Helen, and Simon just mentioned, besides the shortage we see in terms of healthcare workers, right, which are obviously huge, and I feel like every single country is facing these huge shortages. There are also other essential workers that we don't hear about much, or as much as obviously the shortage in healthcare sector is huge and needs to be addressed, but there are also other essential workers who are needed as well, and it goes into the cleaners, housemaid, childcare, and other occupations in which we see huge shortages. There are also essential workers, but we don't necessarily always hear about them in that context. So I just wanted to make sure that I mention these occupations as well. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Susanna. And so many of those sectors haven't actually been affected by COVID. One of the most fantastic charts I saw recently was the growth of the construction sector, and it basically didn't shift in the last year. It's still continuing up, and we're still going to be needing more workers in those sectors. So I think COVID obviously has had a hugely disruptive effect for many sectors of the economy, but these broader trends are still going to continue, and we're still going to need to be thinking about migration pathways. So the second question I think is particularly interesting, which comes back to what we were saying before about the fact that it's easy to measure qualifications. You can say, do you have a bachelor's degree? Yes, no, you're able to access this pathway. But it's much more difficult to be able to measure some of these inherent skills that Susanna was talking about. So there's a question here from an employer who said that they would very much value a worker with a good work ethic, customer service orientation, and the willingness and the ability to learn over a worker with a degree. But how exactly do you screen for those qualities within an immigration system, particularly when there are different sort of cultural demands and cultural norms inherent within different systems? So I'd like to pose that to Kanyon and Simon, and then open it up to Susanna and Natasha in case they have thoughts. So Kanyon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for the qualification, the EPS system introduced like point system. You get a point when you acquire the high proficiency rate of Korean language, and in some cases we measure foreign workers by some technical aspect of some sectors, but it's not enough. I think it is not enough. We should introduce more progressive system that can qualify workers soft skills, language skill, cultural things, something like that. So in terms of qualification, the EPS more way to go. But but the purpose of the EPS system is like introduce low-skilled foreign workers. So in that point, the Korean government like doing fine, but I think for the qualification to end, and especially for beyond, looking beyond for skill dichotomy, the EPS is more way to go for the qualification of foreign workers.
Yeah, I'd echo what Kang-Yeon said, and particularly around things like language. In our scheme, for example, you don't need a great deal of proficiency in the native language to cut asparagus. But if you want to go on a training course and become the supervisor who's telling workers how many spears they should pack on the production line, or things like that, then you do need to improve that skill. And that's one of the things that we try to do. And as you rightly said, attitude and willingness is far more important than a bachelor's degree. But we can't do it on our own. We will need some government help, I think, if we're bringing lots of people into the country. We'd love to see more and more of them succeed and choose a pathway. Because when you're bringing people in a low-skilled, low-paid job, they have limited pathways because they can't afford, as Natasha rightly said, to take time out of work for education. We can help with that to a certain extent, but we can't do the whole thing. But I think it would be great if somebody could.
Natasha?
So I think this is really interesting, this question about soft skills. And I think it would be, I want to illustrate it with an example. So TESDA is one of the most fantastic vocational training institutes in the world. It's the Filipino government's training institute. It has a private component, but it's really governed by the Filipino government. And they train for a variety of skills, including skills that, are commonly described as low skilled, from cleaners to childcare, electricians, construction, whatever. And I went to visit the center in Manila, one of the TESDA centers in Manila. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me about the curriculum is that 1/4 of the curriculum is dedicated to how to tell your employer that there's a problem with the production system. Right? So how to tell your employer that something is wrong and how to frame it in a way that they can understand. Right? So these soft skills, right, about how to problem solve and how to convey the solution to your employer. And it was fully 1/4 of the curriculum. It's really interesting to see how those skills are perceived by employers. Right? So some employers are really keen on these skills, and many are not. Right. So one of the interesting things is that if you go to the Gulf countries where these training systems are often training for, the visa category for Filipinos is one of the few categories that is unfilled by employers, because many employers view this problem-solving soft skill as deeply problematic and as challenging their authority. And oftentimes, the problem-solving skills also comes with an awareness that you have certain rights, that if you're going to work overtime, you should be paid for overtime, et cetera, and so forth, right? That there are certain safety practices that you would like the employer to adhere to, right? So these things tend to go hand in hand. And employers in general, I think, are fairly ambivalent about these problem-solving skills, so that when employers are talking about soft skills, they're often talking about compliance. They're often talking about labor discipline. And, it is a subtext to this story. And I think, in fact, there are many pathway systems that are in existence that give employers the ability to screen for compliance. So, there are a series of blacklist systems. There are there's employer discretion around who's brought back. There's the fact that your visa, right, the visa structures associated with these pathway systems don't allow you to shift employers. You're bound by the visa system to a single employer, which is a form of bonded labor. You don't have the ability to decide how to commodify your own work, right? So, right, this is, in some ways a gross statement, a blunt statement about these things, but I think it's important to pay attention to the undercurrent.
Can I just come in on that one? Under our scheme, that's not true, because we're the sponsor. We work with 150 farms. You can go and work on any of our 150 farms, and you can transfer if you're not happy.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Natasha. Again, it sort of comes back to this interesting balance between, the rights and the abilities that are provided to various different migrants, and sort of the needs of different schemes, different politicians, different policymakers, and different employers, which I do think has come up a few times in the conversation today, and definitely a need for, as Kanyan was talking about, this multi-stakeholder approach to really understand all of those incentives and try and balance them. Great, so we've got our third question here is actually about the terminology, which I think is particularly interesting. So one thing that I've been studying quite a lot recently is Germany's new immigration system, where they have basically opened up their country to people with vocational skills. So people who sit in that mid-tier bracket that Susanna was speaking about. But what is interesting about it is what they've done is effectively expanded the definition of what a skilled migrant is. They haven't tried to say this is a completely different scheme. They haven't tried to explicitly say this is bringing in mid-skilled people. They've just expanded the definition of skilled, which is an interesting way to go about trying to build public support for these types of schemes. And the question that we've got through is about this terminology point. So given the reluctance of sort of authorities and employers in receiving countries to sort of recognize this different level of skills, wouldn't it be better to use different terminologies? So recognize skills or different skills that we could use to try and put people in different buckets. Susanna and Tasha, I don't know what you think about that, whether you have any thoughts on the terminology that we could use or different ways of packaging these.
Absolutely, thank you, Helen. Yes, that is certainly one of the things that we at LM specifically have been recently looking into how to, because I think that what Germany basically did in the example you gave us is basically highlighting the fact that I mentioned as well that these people are skilled, right? While grouping people into high skill and low skill, basically giving us this like hierarchy of someone being above somebody else, and typically just because of the differences in their education. So I certainly agree that the rhetoric and the terminology should change. And I know that there are a variety of countries that are actually looking into like how to change this terminology, but unfortunately there was no result or there was no perfect word that we have been able to come up with just yet. But I totally agree that this hierarchy is no longer working. And as I was actually working on the policy note, I was actually giving this a lot of thought, and it was almost like unnatural to me to say low and high skill, because I have some almost personal feelings about this hierarchy, and so we are definitely determined to continue these discussions and come up with a new terminology. Whether that we already hear a lot about essential workers, but then essential workers are also high and low skill, so that's also not the perfect word. So it's really difficult to come with like the perfect label. Another thing is that what I was trying to mention as well during my presentation is that the whole system of labeling, right, is just not right. It's a package. It's a skills mix, right? So how to get around it? Unfortunately, don't have a clear answer just now, but we're definitely working on it.
Natasha, do you have any thoughts?
So I think it's really interesting that you bring up the example of Germany, Helen, because Germany has a robust apprenticeship system, right? It really is kind of distinguished for that. And so I think the flexibility around the term of skill is in fact informed by the local economic institutional mix. And so, I think it's important to pay attention to that as we think about the definitions of skill. These definitions they don't stand on their own. They're reflective of the institutionally enacted values around who has skill, who doesn't have skill, who's powerful socially and politically in the labor market, and who's not, right? So if you were to use the example of the US construction industry in the US, it's a classic example of an industry that used to be able to portray itself as skilled, but when unions nosedived and were disrupted for a variety of historical reasons, the image of the industry as skilled completely evaporated. And there was, in addition, some de-skilling. But I think it's just important to pay attention to the ways in which these notions of skill grow out of local institutional contexts.
Can I just add something to that, Helen? I was just going to say, I think, rather than, I totally agree that the emphasis on skill is misleading and probably taking us down a wrong road, actually, because it's more about demand. And I would say where we should be steering the conversation is to look at high value. So the value of having somebody you love cared for by somebody in a nursing home might be higher than the value of having another lawyer in your country. Who can say?
Wonderful. Thank you very much all. We've only got a couple of minutes, so I suggest we wrap up here and make sure everybody can get on with their day. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Susanna and Natasha for their presentations, and Simon and Kanyon for their wonderful comments on the various systems that they're working on, and to all of you for being here today and for taking time out of your undoubtedly busy schedules to discuss what I think is an incredibly important topic. Obviously, please do read Susanna's latest paper and do get in touch if you'd like to discuss any of these issues in more detail. So thank you again for being here. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and we'll see you soon. Thank you.